Recording. Okay. Welcome everyone to our research study briefing. A couple housekeeping things before we get started. There's a little Q&A box down below, welcome, and a little chat box. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand so that we know that you have a question and we can pause Anne. And then there's also a little chat box here to the right, and you can ask questions to everybody or just to Anne and myself. And so I'll be monitoring that throughout our time. So good morning or good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us today. I will hand it over to our president and founder, Ann Moses, to get us started.
Hello, everyone. I'm not muted. Right. Good. Okay. Hello, everyone. Getting used to this new platform. I wanted to tell you that I wanted to start by just introducing the study and first talking a little bit just about what Gen Z is, because I realize not everyone knows that. So Generation Z is the youngest generation. Many of them are under 18, but for the purposes of this study that we did, Generation Z are 18 to 25 or 26 years old. So they're the generation right after millennials. And many of them cannot vote, but a number of them can vote. A number of them will be new voters in 2020. But the oldest of Gen Z has been able to vote for 2 election cycles now, coming up on a third. I want to first, before I tell you a little bit about the study, I'm just going to, for those of you who are newer to Ignite, I'm going to do this very briefly, but Ignite builds political power in young women across the country. We are a movement of young women who are ready and eager to become the next generation of political leaders. We launched about 9 years ago. And very generally, we train women in high schools, colleges, and universities across the United States. We train them on how to run. We train them on, the mechanics of running. We train them on how to understand your government and why gender parity and political leadership matters. We train them on policy issues. We introduce them to elected women in their home communities who can become role models and mentors and help them get jobs and enter the political arena. This year, 2019-2020, Ignite is training 10,000 young women across 30 states. And we have a goal of quintupling that to 50,000 young women by the end of 2021. And we are on track to reach that goal. And here's a map with actually not even all of the places that we're in. There's a whole bunch of places on the East Coast. It gets tight there, and also in the West. But Ignite is rapidly growing across the country. And this has been in response to extraordinary demand since 2016. So Ignite, because we've been operating for a long time, we wanted to do a kind of summative impact study. And to do that, we'd always been tracking our young women. But we hadn't ever compared them to a national sample of other women who were not in Ignite. And so that's what we did. We worked with researchers from the Center for American Women in Politics in Washington College. And we pulled a sample of our 18 to 25-year-olds or 18 to 26-year-olds. So these were existing participants and folks who were alumni. And we also pulled a national sample of Gen Z women. We contracted with Qualtrics to conduct this survey of national respondents. And, here's some information about the sample, but for your purposes, without getting into the nitty-gritty of research, this is a nationally weighted sample. The sample is generalizable to the national population of Gen Z women. Both surveys were fielded last summer, and that will become important when we get into some of the data, particularly regarding choice. Okay. So here's what we have learned about Gen Z. And as I talk about this, I'm gonna talk about what we've learned about Gen Z, and then later I'm gonna talk about what we learned about Ignite vis-a-vis, in comparison to the Gen Z population. So Generation Z is the most diverse in our nation's history. Our data showed that. We knew that anyway. These are just Gen Z women, by the way. So 54% of Gen Z women are white. The rest are women of color. This is, again, the same as national. What we saw in our sample I thought was interesting vis-a-vis sexual orientation. Almost 30% of Gen Z women define themselves as LGBTQIA. And this is one I was fairly surprised about. We asked about religiosity, and what we saw was that actually Gen Z is no more or less religious in terms of their attendance at any kind of services than anyone else in the country. That generation has not changed with regard to religiosity. We also looked at ideology. So we looked at ideology and we also looked at party, and these are different. Ideology we looked at on a 7-point scale. When you look at this chart, you can see liberal at the top and conservative at the bottom. Those were actually condensed from extremely liberal to an extremely conservative. And you can see that Generation Z women skew ideologically center. And we looked at it by 3 racial categories as well. And for Black and Latina Gen Z women, especially, they actually skew center to right of center. As I mentioned, that we condensed the liberal and very liberal category and the conservative and very conservative category. And it's interesting because for all the airspace in the media, media attention about the most liberal Americans, right, the super progressives and the super conservatives, the tails were about 6% each, right? So only 6% of Gen Z women define themselves as extremely liberal, and only 6% of Gen Z women define themselves as extremely conservative. The most are in the middle. But we also looked at party registration. And what we saw was that Gen Z women are disproportionately registered Democrat, which means that their ideological leanings do not correlate with party registration at all. The other thing that I think is really worth noting here is that so about half of Gen Z women are Democrat. But this is what's really extraordinary. 25% of them identify as independent. And that has never been the case in any generation in American politics. And I will tell you that independent group is this kind of motley crew of very, very progressive women who think the Democratic Party isn't doing enough, right? Who isn't progressive enough. Moderate conservative women who are really anti the Republican Party right now, true independents, and then a bunch of young women who are kind of like to hell with the 2-party system. They just don't see it as useful or meaningful in any way. In fact, they see it as detrimental. And then, of course, we looked at party registration by race, and what you can see is that, if you remember, I said here that Gen Z Black and Latina women skew center to right of center. But if you look at party registration by race here, Black and Latina women skew Democrat. So there really is not much correlation between ideology and ideological leanings and party registration right now for this generation. So we had this thought, well, maybe it has something to do with the president. And so that was one of the questions we asked. We asked Gen Z women whether or not it's a 4-point scale, have a very favorable view of the president, a somewhat favorable view, a somewhat unfavorable view, or a very unfavorable view. We condensed them into binary categories. So the yellow are the folks who actually like the president, and the pinks are the people who do not. And then we looked at this by party. We looked at it in a number of ways, but this is really the way you can see it the most, which is by party. So for Democrat and independent Gen Z women, they have a very disfavorable view of the president. For Republican women, it's still not great. I want to talk for a moment about the Republican women. This sample, one of the reasons why we had to double, we actually originally were going to pull equal size samples of the Ignite women and the Gen Z non-Ignite women. And the reason why we didn't is because Republican Gen Z women, there's so few of them that we needed to double the sample of Gen Z women in order to get a statistically significant group of Republican women. So this Republican group is probably about 250 to 300 women. It is statistically significant because it's weighted and matched to the national sample, but it's a very, very small group. And you can see that only 38% still have an unfavorable view of the president. The other thing I will tell you about this Republican group is that it's highly, highly correlated with high levels of religiosity, and in particular with evangelical. There tend to be evangelical. And so when we start getting to choice, you'll start seeing where that plays out. So the next thing we looked at, I'm sure many of you on the call have been watching these Democratic presidential debates. And it seems to me, at least, that when we watch them, the thing we hear about again and again and again and again and again is healthcare. It's as if it's the only issue anyone cares about. But we wanted to find out what Gen Z women cared about. And so we gave them a huge list and we said, can you rank this and tell us for each issue, is this hugely important to you, somewhat important to you, or not at all one of your top issues? And then we ordered them. And so for Gen Z women, the issues that they care most about are not being focused on at the national level on either side of the aisle, frankly. So the highest priority issues for Gen Z women: gun violence, mass shootings. This is hugely important. It's not surprising. This is the generation that's grown up with mass shootings on their campuses and in their schools and in their communities. Climate change, also not surprising. Gen Z is very few climate deniers in this group, and they are personally also experiencing the immediate effects of climate change in real time. Education, and also lumped in with education is student loan debt. Obviously, this is hugely important to them. And then racial inequality. And I thought that was interesting. I was surprised to see that as issue number 4. Issue number 5, we only put 4 on this, though, is immigration. Just so in case people always ask about that. And then, of course, the low priority issues. We took in the same list, we looked at the ones that were the least interesting or the least personally relevant. They said these aren't important to us when thinking about what we want to change in the world. So infrastructure and investment, I'm not surprised. It is critically important, but it isn't really talked about, and it isn't particularly sexy. It's not covered by the news media at all. Drug legalization, again, not surprising. It's happening all over the country. Same with LGBTQ rights. Gay marriage is a reality for this generation. They don't understand why anyone would object to it, and this is also a low priority for them. And then this one I thought was interesting, which is abortion. And we'll talk about abortion in a second more thoroughly, but remember when I said at the outset, this survey was fielded in the summer, and it was fielded fairly close to, and in fact overlapping with, many of the extreme anti-choice pieces of legislation that were getting passed in states across the country, and it may not have been registering yet as an issue when the survey was fielded. Because when you look at Gen Z women and abortion, and access to abortion, opinions differ by political party, but even among the Republican Gen Z women, most of these women want access to abortion rights. And in fact, Gen Z is actually the generation that is most supportive of access to choice. And so you only have on that pie chart on the left, like 15% of these young women only 15% want no access under any circumstance. And that correlates almost 100% with the evangelical group. And 44% want unrestricted access, so access under any circumstances, no government intervention or restrictions. And then 41% want access with some restrictions. And that's, a combination of, all the things you hear talked about, in the case of rape, health and grave danger to the mother, stuff like that. And then if you look at it by party, right, still Gen Z women are predominantly pro-choice. And by the way, this research matches all the research that's been done by other organizations on this generation and access to abortion rights. All right. So then we wanted to also look at, this is part of the comparison that we wanted to look at. We really wanted to look at Ignite's impact on political engagement for this generation of young women. And we saw a few things that were interesting. First of all, just Generation Z in general is actually more politically engaged than ever before. But they still lag well behind Ignite Women on every measure of political engagement. So we looked at about 10 measures of political engagement. You can only see 6 on this chart. And on every measure of political engagement, we were really happy to see that Gen Z women generally actually are more engaged than any generation before them when they were the youngest generation, right? And so you can look, I attended protests or rallies, not surprising given the immense women's marches and march for gun violence, marches against gun violence and for environmental and climate justice. But all of these factors, young women are actually fairly engaged. Ignite Women were 3 to 5 times more engaged on every single measure. And in fact, when we just amalgamated the number of types of political engagement you could have as an individual in the last year, Ignite Women scored at 6.5. Of 10 in the past year, and the average American Gen Z woman scored at 2.9. So Ignite is doing really well in terms of impacting young women's civic and political engagement, which is great because that is our explicit goal. We also looked at in political ambition for Gen Z women as compared to Ignite Women. And again, we saw, well, first I want to note that we asked a 5-point question, how interested are you in running for office? And this is only looking at the absolute tippy top. I definitely plan to run for office in the future. So 8% of Gen Z women said they definitely plan to run for office in the future. And that may sound low to you, but it is a national high for any generation. There is a ton of national research on women who are, partners in law firms, in the kinds of professions where they really are set up to run. And historically, it's been like 1 to 2% at best. So already for this generation, we're at 8%, which is pretty good. And then Ignite triples that. So 24% of our young women said they definitely plan to run for office in the future. And I'm not surprised about that because we're actually seeing them starting to run now at very, very early. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, we actually had 3 women who at 22 to 24 years old just won their races in the 2019 off-year elections. We also looked at voting because there is a story we tell in America that young people do not vote. And that story has historically been true. And so therefore, as a country, we tend to ignore young people in terms of trying to get them to vote, speaking to them and speaking to the issues that they care about when we are candidates. And so we wanted to look at voting rates for Gen Z women, and we wanted to compare those to Ignite voting rates. And what we saw is that Gen Z women are in fact voting at the highest rates in US history. And Ignite women vote at more than twice that rate. So if you look at the 2016 presidential election, that actually is pretty low for Gen Z women, 46%. And that is kind of standard for Gen Z women. They are usually around 50% in a presidential. But then you look at 2018 and you look and you think, oh my God, wait, why are those women voting at almost the same rates they voted in 2016? And what you see is that Gen Z women are politically motivated now. Something happened in 2016 and they are now turning out at crazy rates. I will also tell you that Gen Z women, the Ignite sample is largely a college and post-college sample, meaning our young women are in college or went to college, most of them, because that's where we actually train them, is on college and university campuses. The Gen Z sample is not all college students. It's 18 to 26-year-olds, and it's and about 70% of them nationally go to college, but about 30% don't. When you look at, this isn't on this slide, but when you look at college voting rates for 2018, they were 40% nationally, and the women were actually at 44%. So 44% of female college students in America voted in 2018. And that is the highest we've ever seen. Um, we also looked at voting rates. We also looked at Ignite's impact on just sort of voting behaviors generally. Registering people to vote or serving at poll workers, Ignite is 3 times the national average for Gen Z women. Encouraging your friends and family to vote. Again, Ignite women do that at twice the rate of young Gen Z women across the country. We then asked them about their likelihood to vote in 2020. It's not a perfect question. Obviously, people are highly aspirational when they talk about that. But if you just look at the white and the green sections, which is, I am absolutely certain to vote. So when someone says that, you should believe them. And then I'm likely to vote. These are still super high rates for every single group, right? And also, I would believe the not likely to vote people. If they say they're not likely to vote, then they're probably being honest. And still, it's only a tiny little percentage, really. And so when you look at all this data together, what you see is that Gen Z women are really likely to vote at extremely high rates in 2020. Now, this is not a perfect way of looking at data for all the data wonks on the call. I don't know how many of you are there. What we did is we looked at, it's a very simplistic way of looking at the data. The pink line is the women, the yellow line is the men. And actually, we wanted to look at a history of this just so you could kind of see how the trends work. And so actually from 2006 to 2012, Gen Z women couldn't vote at all. Those are actually millennials when they're just kind of coming of age to vote. But the trends hold steady, right? So typically what you see, and the men, by the way, vote at about 7% lower than women in every generation. The youngest generation is no exception. The gap may be slightly larger at the youngest generation. Women are actually more politically engaged in every generation. They just don't run for office at the same rates. But so if you look at the first two, you can see what we've done is we've created these sort of lines that are between the midterm and the next presidential election. So 2006 midterm, very low turnout. 2008 presidential, that's when Obama first ran, and you would think the turnout for the youngest generation would have been high, but look, it's only about 52% for the women. Again, 2010, Obama's second midterm, 2012, his second presidential election. Not surprising, it's a second term presidency. Rates usually get depressed a little bit, but the trend holds true. Then Gen Z, the very first election that any of them could have voted in was 2014. And you can see, wow, those rates are terribly, terribly low. That's Obama's, that's the second midterm for Obama. And then 2016, again, still pretty low, but what you see is a tendency to double, plus or minus 2 to 5 points, right? So now you look at the Gen Z voting rates in 2018 and look how much higher they were. And so now if you make a similar prediction as to what's going to happen in 2020, we're looking at for Gen Z women, something around 70%. Now you'll remember this data is imperfect and the analysis of it is imperfect. Part of the way it's imperfect is that the way we calculate voting rates in this country is that we go out and do census questionnaires for large samples. It's actually operated by the census and it's called the Current Population Survey. But Tufts University, as I mentioned before, did a study on young people and voting, and they actually matched all college students to the voter file and found out that, as I said, 44% of college women in 2018 voted. And when you talk to those researchers, and they know this with absolute certainty because they match it to the voting file, when you talk to those researchers, they will tell you that they think we're looking at a potential 80% turnout for college students in this country in 2020. So briefly before I end, I just wanted to talk about the implications for 2020 and beyond. First is the most obvious. The polls are not reaching Gen Z and young millennial women voters, women or men. Older voters are being oversampled. So whenever you hear these polls, these national polls, which aren't great to begin with, and then these polls about which candidates are preferred, you should take them with a grain of salt, because if you've only voted once or twice, you are not being polled. Two, I mean, this seems obvious to me, but if the candidates, presidential, congressional, city council, anyone, state legislative candidates want to mobilize Gen Z women, they really should start talking about the issues these voters care about, especially gun violence and climate change. You'll remember that Obamacare actually put Gen Z women and men on their, if they don't have their own personal insurance, they are still on their parents' insurance. And so healthcare is actually not the most personally pressing issue for them. In terms of choice, I think there's a massive opportunity to galvanize this generation of women around access to reproductive healthcare services and choice. And I haven't seen that happening. It's not our Ignite's mission per se, but I've always wondered about why both sides of the choice movement tend to be ignoring the youngest generation. And then, from our perspective, the last thing that we learned is that we are hugely effective at increasing Gen Z women's political participation, both in terms of voter turnout and just political engagement on every level, and then getting our young women to run. And so I'm eager to get us into all 50 states as quickly as possible so that we can keep having that kind of impact. So in terms of next steps and conclusions, then I'm going to open it up to questions. We are now conducting focus groups of Gen Z women by ideological party grouping to understand what's drawing them to and repelling them from the respective parties and what's holding them back from political leadership and engagement. And then as we approach 2020, Ignite is preparing to leverage all the work that we're doing and all this research to mobilize young women across the country as voters, and then also for the census. With that, I want to open it up to questions. I will.
I'm back.
You're back. Sarah can make it happen.
I haven't seen any yet. Folks, you can either raise your hand or just pop your question into the chat box. Ooh, I see a hand raised.
Who raised their hand?
I'll just have her talk. I'll do allowed to talk. Let's do that.
There you go. Talking permitted.
Okay, I think it's working. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
Great.
Hello.
Hello, this is Colleen from Battery Powered. I am really impressed with this. Thanks for sharing it all. Really great. I was particularly impressed with the propensity for Ignite women to run for office, and I think it was triple the rest of the population. Do you have any sense of whether the folks participating in Ignite were already going to be that engaged and they decided to join Ignite because they were already super excited about doing this, or to what extent they were like your average Gen Z woman and got inspired because of their participation in Ignite? Any idea about correlation or causation there?
Yeah, that's a great question. We can't do causation at all. So there's no causation with this. The one thing I can tell you is that we didn't do a pre with many of them because this is actually, we just grabbed at them when they were either out of Ignite or still participating as college students. Mm-hmm. All I can tell you is that our young women come to us because they're interested in, at the very least, fixing the issues that they see in their community, mm-hmm. right? And so historically, what Ignite has had to do is take women who, and I suspect a lot of the people who are on this call right now may have been those women, right, who were, like I always use the example, I have two kids, and one of my kids sort of goes through the life and she's trapped in her own head and she is politically engaged, she's interested, but she doesn't look around her community and say, why are we stepping over homeless people? And the other does. Right? She wants to talk about that stuff and she doesn't understand why is no one doing something about that. Now, those young women don't want to run for office. Typically, what they do is they want to fix the issues that happen, that they see as problematic in their communities. Mm-hmm. And then they come to Ignite, and what we say to them is, you can fix these issues, and here's how you understand policy, and here might be solutions, and what kind of solutions would you come to? But also, the best way to fix those solutions is actually to be the ones making the policies, not the ones yelling at the people making the policies. Mm-hmm. By and large, the young women who come to Ignite feel very drawn to activism, and they're comfortable in that space. But they're not necessarily comfortable in the space of saying, actually, I have the idea on how to fix this, and I'm going to run for office to make sure that idea happens. Mm-hmm. And so we can't do the kind of correlation causation you're asking about, because frankly, we could do it. It would be extraordinarily costly. We would have to pre-survey every single young woman who comes through our doors, and then post-survey them, and then pre-survey a national sample of young women who aren't in Ignite, and then post-survey them as well.
Right.
And so we didn't do that kind of, this was actually, doing this kind of survey is expensive enough, actually. But I still feel pretty good that our young women, I think our young women are coming in differently in that they are all geared towards, why do we have so much gun violence? Or, what's up with all this homelessness? And the Gen Z women may not be coming at it with that same mindset. Some of them are, but some of them aren't.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No one raising their hand? Oh, I see a question. Is that a question?
Where?
Oh, given the anticipated high voter rate for 2020, what do we need to be mindful of that may reduce participation? That is a good question. What do we need to be mindful of? I struggle on this because I worry that I worry about, on the Democratic side, we know at Ignite, so something that is not showing up in this data, but we've been doing this kind of spot research we've been polling about 2,000 of our young women about a few days after every Democratic debate. And we have been doing it long before the debate started, actually. We started doing it last January. And so we can do these text polls. They are not scientific, I will tell you. We take 2,000 young women. They're the same 2,000 young women. We know they voted in 2018, and we send out a text poll, as I said, every 6 weeks or so. And what we have seen with these young women is this kind of shuffling of the candidates. When Beto got in, he was sort of high, and then he fell, which we saw nationally. But what we've seen is this ascendance of, now these are just Ignite women, granted, of Elizabeth Warren as kind of the preferred candidate. What we've also seen is, in contrast with the national polls, is Joe Biden really never took hold with this generation. What I worry about a little bit is that if the candidate, so what we know about Gen Z is that they don't love the president. What we also know about Gen Z is that they're ideologically centrist, but that they're disproportionately registered Democrat. What I worry about is that if they don't like the Democratic presidential candidate, could we have another situation as we did in 2016 where the youngest generation, which by the way is getting very, very large, stays home. And so I think the most important thing we can do to be mindful of is that it's going to be all hands on deck, right? Whoever the candidate is. Like, I think in general, we rely in America on candidates to motivate political participation and voting in particular. And I think we have an opportunity here in 2020 to not necessarily make this about any particular presidential candidate, but to make it about participation in the democratic process, and to frankly leverage the excitement and energy after 2018 and around the fact that this generation is different, right? So I have been on a kind of full court press with the media and with all these press outlets to talk about the fact that, hey, 2018 was different. Stop talking about the youngest generation as a generation that doesn't vote. It's no longer true. Start talking about this generation as a generation that has extraordinary political power, because we want them to get excited about voting and get excited about making this decision and get excited about deciding the future of our country. But I also think that for everyone on the call and everyone in the world, everyone in this country, we all know this next generation of women. Everyone on this call knows Gen Z women. And it is up to all of us to make sure that we give them the tools to not just vote, but to register people to vote, to convince their communities to vote, and for them to understand how much political power they have and how much political power they flexed in 2018 and how much more they can flex in 2020, regardless of who the candidate is.
Thank you, Anne. We have our next question from Dale. Our question is, in addition to leveraging Gen Z women to do massive voter registration, are you doing anything to mobilize them to work on campaigns and ultimately to get out the vote?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So Ignite actually is doing a series of trainings this year called Boss Ladies, where we're actually training young women to work on campaigns. So historically, campaigns have been run by older white men. Not so much in the Bay Area. For those of the folks who are on the call in the Bay Area right now, actually, we have a lot of women running campaign consultant firms in the Bay Area. That is not normal. And the reason why it matters is that gatekeepers, which, we've all heard this research, women need to be asked 7 times to run for office and women aren't asked at the same rates. It's the people who ask matters. And the people who ask, in the political world, we kind of refer to as gatekeepers. And these are people in the campaign world, campaign consultants, existing elected officials, right? People in the political parties. And if those people are older white men, then the people that tend to be asked and to actually hear themselves being asked are older white men. And so we need to make sure that campaigns are diverse. And so we've been doing a series of trainings across the country, training young women to actually go and work on campaigns, and in particular, young women of color. The other thing I think is really important about that is that the kind of advice that you get is aligned with the polling, right? And so young people won't vote, communities of color won't vote, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that you hear from longstanding political consultants, and it isn't necessarily true, and it doesn't have to be true anymore. And I'll give an example of a young woman of ours, one of our alumni who just won public office. She's a 22-year-old Latina woman in Dallas, Texas. She was just elected to the school board. And when she hired her first campaign consultant, her district is sort of half Latina and a small proportion of Black. And then about 40, little less than half middle-class white folks. And in general, that is who has voted in her district. And so when she decided to run, her campaign consultant said, don't focus on your side and don't focus on your neighborhood, focus on the folks who vote all the time. And she said, no, actually, that's not how I'm going to win. I will certainly go to the kind of consistent older voter neighborhood, and I will certainly knock on all those doors. But my candidacy, the very act of me running for office, has the potential to motivate new people to participate in our democracy. And so she actually did a massive voter registration effort and get out the vote effort in her community, her neighborhood, her part of the district, and hired young people to work on her campaign who, and ended up winning both. First of all, she won the seat with something like 75%, but she turned out massively in a community that had not turned out to vote before at all. So I think it's really important that we have young women working on campaigns, and Ignite has always been very explicit about that. One of the volunteering and working on a campaign is one of the measures in which Ignite is 5 times better than the national average in terms of Gen Z women. The other reason we want them working on campaigns is that if you want to run for office and you feel like you don't know what you're doing, well, work on a campaign, particularly just a municipal campaign, and you will understand very quickly what it's like to run for office and what the mechanics are. Was that part of? And ultimately get out the vote. Yes. So Ignite is also, we work with all our young women on college campuses across the country to do voter registration efforts of all young women and all young people and all adult people. I mean, they do voter registration on their college campuses. And then we work with, and then those same college students, once voter registration is closed, they do massive GOTV efforts, not on behalf of a candidate. Ignite is a 501c3, not on behalf of a candidate or a party, but just turning out the vote. And that is done across the country.
Any other questions, folks?
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for those of you who've been supporting us and for helping us do this work. Obviously, it's incredibly important. I'll tell you that we will have the results of some of these focus groups probably in the next 5 months or so. And we'll be updating this kind of research and also this information as well. And so look for another webinar about this, just to talk about young women in the parties as 2020 progresses. So thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. And we look forward to your support and helping Ignite reach more young women across the country. Have a good day.
Thank you.